Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Early fornicated, Virginia bifurcated, and now Early gets designated a position in the Confederate government. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following Virginia's Ordinance of Secession, the Old Dominion mobilized its military in anticipation of a federal invasion of the state. Men came from all walks of life to enlist in Virginia's army, and Jubal Early was eager to take part in the conflict. However, he didn't look like a military man. As one of his biographers explained, his attitude showed in his dress, which was determinedly civilian. In the first months of the war, some Southern officers and a great number of the men were still wearing a mixture of uniform and civilian clothes. But Early's mode of dress was not only downright unmilitary, it was not even the garb of a lawyer or other man of importance in civil life. To one observer, it looked like the attire of a farmer in ordinary circumstances. To another, Jubal's raiment made him look like a stage driver. A third observer, who thought Early's scruffiness a pose, was reminded of Plato's speech to Diogenes, that he showed his vanity by his rags. Early was dispatched to Lynchburg, Virginia, with the responsibility of getting new recruits trained and ready for combat. Lynchburg's position as a transportation center would be a vital location in Virginia and for the Confederacy, and Early helped by commanding the area as he trained his recruits. The enlistees were spirited as they began drill and could be a little rambunctious, but Early's dark eyes was said to be able to back down even the most confident volunteer. It was probably around this time that he was given the nickname Old Jube or Old Jubilee. At Camp Davis, the camp of instruction at Lynchburg, Early hurriedly attempted to arm his troops, a Herculean task in this early stage of the war, as other commanders and other states sought to get their hands on arms and ammunition for their soldiers. Early soldiered on, getting as many men prepared for combat as possible, but he could only arm them as equipment was sent to him. Union inclusions in northern Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., led to a buildup of Confederate forces around Manassas Junction, under the command of Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. On June 19th, Early was sent to Beauregard, where he took command of the 6th Brigade, consisting of the 24th and 7th Virginia and 4th South Carolina regiments. The brigade watched the crossings of Bull Run near its confluence with the Occoquan River. A 3-gun section of the Washington artillery was also given to Early to help him guard the location. On July 18th, the lead elements of the Union Army made it to Blackburn's Ford, guarded by James Longstreet's brigade, with Early's brigade in reserve. During the fight, Longstreet asked Early for reinforcements, and he came up with the 7th Virginia, led by James Kemper, his old Mexican war comrade, and the 7th Louisiana, commanded by Harry Hayes. The columns of soldiers were getting hit in a sporadic fire of bullets as they advanced toward the position. As men went down, Early turned to a colonel and asked, "What do you think of secession now?" The colonel replied, "Oh, the fun has just commenced." Early said, "Well, you'll get enough of it before it's over." Longstreet's men pushed across Bull Run, and Longstreet wanted Early to join him, but either Early didn't understand the orders or ignored them, because he never crossed Bull Run that day. By July 21st, the Union made their presence known again. Early again was ordered by Longstreet to cross at McLean's Ford and attack an artillery battery that was peppering Longstreet's men, preventing them from attacking. Early found a scout perched in a tree on his way to the ford, and the scout informed him that his route to the battery would be watched by the artillerymen, and it would be difficult to cover the ground without getting hit the entire time by artillery. Before he could cross, a messenger rode up with word from Beauregard to pull back and come to headquarters. Early was relieved because he feared that the attack he was about to make would have destroyed his command. Early gathered his forces and proceeded to Beauregard's location, but he didn't know exactly where that was. Before he left the area, Early asked Longstreet to give him a handful of companies that he had loaned him, but Longstreet said extricating them from their location would be hazardous, to take the 13th Mississippi led by William Barksdale. They were close by and wouldn't draw enemy fire when they moved. Early agreed and headed where he believed Beauregard would be. He headed to the Confederate left, eventually finding the commander of all Confederate forces on the field, Joseph E. Johnston. Early asked Johnston where he should go, but Johnston was behind the lines sending troops to the front. He didn't know the precise location to place Early's men, so he simply said, "March until there isn't anyone on your left, then attack." The brigade marched 6 miles in about 3 hours. arriving at a critical point during the battle. As Early approached, Colonel Jeb Stuart informed him that the Federal troops in his front were weak, and that if the infantry attacked, the enemy would break and run. Stuart's cavalry occupied a position near an artillery battery, and with the added pressure of about 1,500 infantry from Early's brigade, the Confederates sent the Federals scurrying away, with many giving chase. Early would halt his exhausted men not too long into the chase. That evening he met again Jefferson Davis, but this time Davis was not an officer in the Mississippi Regiment like in Mexico. Now Davis was president of the Confederacy. Early returned to his command about midnight. Weirdly, Early praised the Union commander Irvin McDowell, who he knew from West Point. He claimed that Winfield Scott had commanded the battle from his desk in Washington, and the defeat shouldn't be laid at McDowell's feet. More interesting was Early's praise of McDowell's strict orders for his soldiers not to commit any depredations against civilians while on campaign. Although pilfering and destruction of property was done by Union soldiers, Early respected McDowell's order, and he trusted that McDowell attempted to stop any property damage. This would become a big issue to Early later in the war. The next few months would be a time of idleness, for the most part, as the Confederate Army under Joseph E. Johnston remained in northern Virginia. Early's brigade was placed with another brigade commanded by Richard Ewell in a division commanded by Mississippian Earl Van Dorn. For his accomplishments at First Bull Run, Early received the rank of brigadier general. The brigade moved camps multiple times over the winter of 1861 into 1862, and every time Early got more irritated at the time it took for the move, mostly because of the huge amount of personal baggage kept by officers and men alike. He attempted to show the men that a light load would be better for them in the long run, but they weren't willing to do without their superfluous supplies. Another thing that Early tried to end was wives going with their officer husbands on campaign. Early felt that wives distracted his officers in the making of war, and he also felt that it wasn't right that officers got to have wives along while men in the ranks didn't. He tried issuing orders to get women out of the camp, and it worked for the most part, except for what he called the more annoying of the wives. Early was an irascible man, and one story came out at this time that is unconfirmed but seems to go along with Early's attitude and manners. At a luncheon for the Marylanders who were coming into the Confederate Army, the ladies of Maryland presented flags to the regiments, and during the meal a toast was suggested in honor of Bernard B., Francis Bartow, and C.F. Fisher, dead heroes of the First Battle of Bull Run. Early objected on the grounds that no Virginian was being toasted. The crowd became angry and took sides, but were eventually calmed down. Early left and remarked, "Didn't I stand up for old Virginia?" In April 1862, Early and his command, now made up of the 24th and 38th Virginia and the 5th and 23rd North Carolina, marched to the peninsula in Virginia to report to General John B. Magruder to defend against Union Major General George McClellan's push up the peninsula to take Richmond. Early was stationed near Williamsburg with the 2nd Florida Regiment and the 2nd Mississippi Battalion temporarily assigned to the brigade. The brigade was attached to the North Carolinian Daniel Harvey Hill's division and remained in reserve. When a brigade of Union soldiers under Winfield Scott Hancock took command of an abandoned Confederate artillery position on the left flank and began shelling the Confederate position with artillery, Early and his brigade were dispatched to deal with Hancock's troops. Hill, the division commander, would lead the North Carolina units, while Early led the Virginians. In a tangled undergrowth of the woods on the left flank, the regiments got separated, leaving only one Virginia regiment and one North Carolina regiment to make the attack. Early's Virginians struck the position first. Early avoided the artillery shells, but in the attack, a bullet slammed into his shoulder and another slammed into his neck. The musketry partially blinded his horse as well. Early moved to the rear and was going to attempt to dismount, but realized that the movement was too painful, and that if he dismounted, he probably couldn't remount his horse, so he remained in the saddle. The attack fell apart and the brigade went back into the woods. The wound to his neck wasn't significant, but the shoulder wound was much more serious, the bullet having entered one shoulder and traveled to the other. As long as infection didn't set in, he would just be sore and make a recovery. He first went to a hospital, then traveled to Richmond, and stayed in the American Hotel before traveling back to Franklin County. He stayed there not quite 2 months before pressuring a doctor to allow him to return to service. He got to Richmond amid the 7 Days Battle and joined the command of Stonewall Jackson just before the Battle of Malvern Hill. Brigade Commander Arnold Elzey had been wounded at Gaines' Mill during the 7 days, and Early took command of his forces into the division commanded by Richard Ewell. As Early and his brigade were maneuvering to attack Malvern Hill, they came to a creek where they encountered the division commander Ewell. Ewell put the brigade in command of the lieutenant colonel who commanded the lead regiment, then told Early to follow him, taking him out of the battle. By the time Early made it back to his brigade, it was after 9 p.m., and the men, suffering few casualties, slept on the field. It was an odd moment in Early's military career thus far, and for the battle, no one can point to why Ewell took the brigade commander away from his men. Nevertheless, the Battle of Malvern Hill resulted in McClellan going back down the peninsula, but another enemy force emerged to the north, a new Union army named the Army of Virginia, commanded by John Pope, who came from the western campaigns, and now occupied northern Virginia. Pope claimed that in the west, we have always seen the backs of our enemies. Ewell allegedly responded, "By God, he'll never see the backs of my men. Their pants are out at the rear, and the sight would paralyze this western bully." Early and his brigade proceeded north under Stonewall Jackson's half of the newly named Army of Northern Virginia. Near Gordonsville, Early felt strong enough about the possibility of being replaced that he wrote to General Robert E. Lee, commander of the army, about his position. Arnold Elzey, Early knew, would recover and possibly seek his old command back, and Early worried that he would be cast out for not having a command. His old command had been divided up, and under Confederate law, at the dissolution of the brigade, the commander essentially lost their command, and he feared he wouldn't regain one. Lee wrote to him a soothing message stating that Elzey would be entitled to his command if and when he returned. But surely you would be considered entitled to another command. Confidence in your zeal and ability has been increased instead of diminished by your service, and that honorable wound you received at Williamsburg in the defense of your country is viewed as a badge of distinction, and claimed for higher consideration instead of crime as you suppose. With Early's fear assuaged, he was prepared to lead his brigade into battle with confidence. Jackson moved north to find Pope and his army. Richard Ewell's division, containing Early's command, was in the lead as they approached Cedar Mountain. Federal cavalry could be seen in the distance guarding a ridge. Jackson told Ewell to move Early's brigade forward and use the other two brigades to swing over Cedar Mountain and hit the Federals in the flank. Early waited, as instructed, for word from Charles Winder, the commander of the division right behind Ewell, that he was prepared to move forward in support of him. When word came that Winder's division was on the move, Early pushed his men against the Union skirmishers and took a position on the ridge formerly occupied by the enemy cavalry. Union infantry lurked in the cornstalks of a field in his front, but just out of rifle range, so Early waited. His brigade was the only one in the field, but Winder's men came up and the rest of Ewell's division got into position. All of a sudden, a battery of heavy artillery galloped up on Early's left. They didn't see the enemy infantry in the cornfield and began to unlimber their guns. Irritated and scared for the safety of the guns, Early grumbled as he switched his plug of tobacco from one side to the other, then ordered his men forward to save the artillery from certain annihilation. The infantry got to the guns in the nick of time, sending the enemy back into the cornstalks. However, Early got a glimpse of the approaching enemy. Their battle line overlapped his own. Soon some of Winder's brigades approached the field, and the roar of musketry was heard far and wide. The rebel battle line began to break, including those on Early's left flank. The leader of the 12th Georgia on his right flank, a 65-year-old captain named William F. Brown, endeared himself to Early when Early ordered him to hold at all hazards, and Brown's reply was, "General, my ammunition is nearly out. Don't you think we had better charge them?" Early needed to keep the integrity of the line and told him to hold his ground. Soon Jackson himself made an appearance, and then A.P. Hill's light division came onto the scene and threw back the Union attacks. As Early would state about battles, people forget that but for the troops whose obstinate fighting enabled the fresh ones to come up in time, the day would have been irretrievably lost before the appearance of the latter. It is an old saying that it is the last feather that breaks the camel's back, yet the last feather would do no harm but for the weight that precedes it. The first feature contributes as much as the last to the catastrophe. Jackson's wing of the army pushed north in an attempt to get around the flank of Pope's army and cut off its communications with Washington, D.C. The wing came to the Rappahannock River and needed to cross, but the nearest bridge was destroyed. Jackson ordered Ewell to send a few brigades over to assess the other side of the river. Then the whole division and wing would cross. Early's brigade crossed an old dam, but by dark the rains that fell all day flooded the river and trapped Early and his men on the north bank. Another of Ewell's brigades supposedly crossed upriver, and when Early sent someone to find it, his staffer came back with 6 enemy soldiers as prisoners. When the Federals attempted to take the staffer as a prisoner, the staffer convinced them that they were surrounded by 2 Confederate brigades and to be his prisoners. They agreed and returned to Early. If Union forces were that close, then the situation was perilous. Early hid his men in some scrub on the north bank and waited for word from Ewell or Jackson. At one point, a column of curious Union soldiers formed up and fired a volley into the scrub, but Early told his men to lay down and not say a word. The darkness and the lack of movement by the rebels convinced the Union men to leave, believing they had accomplished their goal. Finally, the waters receded, and word came that Ewell would cross his entire division, but Early quickly sent word to him and Jackson that the Union Army was too close to make a crossing at that location. He advised that all the men on the north bank recross the river. Jackson took his advice, which proved to be right. Over 20,000 Union soldiers laid not far away from the crossing. Early moved his men across the river and won high praise from Jackson for his ingenuity and coolness under pressure. Soon the wing moved around Pope's flank and got into his supply base, helping themselves to all kinds of goods previously destined for the Union Army. Jackson's orders were to attack the communications and supplies, which he had done, then to draw him to battle, when Lee and James Longstreet's wing got closer. Jackson moved his men behind an unfinished railroad cut as a defensive position to buy time until Lee and Longstreet could come up. Pope attacked Jackson along that defensive line, which became the Second Battle of Bull Run. During its opening phase, Early and his brigade were essentially detached from Ewell's division, now commanded by Alexander Lawton, when Ewell was badly wounded in the leg, requiring amputation. Early guarded the far left flank of Jackson's line. Then when Pope began to attack the left flank commanded by A.P. Hill's division, Early maneuvered back across the battlefield to support the division. Hill's men began to run out of ammunition, and some regiments began to fall back, unable to stem the tide of Union soldiers attacking their position. In a miraculous moment, as the Confederate front line faltered, Early ordered his men to advance, then charge, driving back the Federals. Humorously, his men didn't want to stop, and after repeated attempts to halt the column, he yelled, "Well, if you will go, go on." Early held that position as Hill's men went to the rear to get resupplied with ammunition, and succeeded in pushing back some Union attacks against his flank. The next day, with Longstreet's wing on the field and ready to attack, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia pushed the Federals off the field. Jackson's wing was ordered to continue the pursuit of the Federals as they retreated back toward Washington. At the Battle of Chantilly along that retreat, Union forces launched an attack against Jackson to allow their comrades to safely withdraw. In the fight, Early's command was held in reserve. When heavy fighting erupted on the left of the line, he moved his brigade in that direction only to find that 3 regiments weren't with him. When he found them, they were fighting near the center of the line when some Louisiana soldiers broke under the weight of the Federal attacks. The Battle of Chantilly ended, and the Union forces were able to get away. In his report of the events at the end of August 1862, Early asked to be excused for referring to the record shown by my own brigade, which has never been broken, or compelled to fall back, or left one of its dead to be buried by the enemy, but has invariably driven the enemy when opposed to him and slept upon the ground on which it has fought in every action, with the solitary exception of the affair at Bristow Station, when it retired under order, covering the withdrawal of other troops. The Army of Northern Virginia moved into Maryland, where they found citizens less supportive of their invasion. Early and his command rested at Monocacy Junction, getting issued salt and flour before getting word that Lee ordered Jackson to capture the garrison at Harper's Ferry. As they marched through the Maryland countryside, Early's command went through the town of Frederick. The soldiers marched down its streets, and a little girl about 10 years old with her younger sister were standing alongside the road, waving a small United States flag, saying, "Hurrah for the Stars and Stripes." One rebel soldier threatened to take the flag from the little girl until Early rode up and ordered him to leave her alone, that she was doing no harm. Early's command marched with Jackson to Harper's Ferry and captured the garrison there, then proceeded to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where Lee and the rest of the army was. Early and his brigade took up a position on the Confederate left not far from a whitewashed church known as the Dunkard Church. It was September 16th, and there had been some fighting in that sector, but the full weight of the Union Army of the Potomac was descending upon the hills around the town of Sharpsburg, and Early knew that there would be a terrible fight the next day.